and welcome to the Unknown Webcast. This is just a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones. I really am so conservative, I can't turn left even when I'm driving. In addition to giving trigger warnings, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection. This week, our friend Dr. Phil Fernandez, president of the International Association of Christian Apologetics, president of the Institute of Biblical Defense, and pastor of Trinity Bible Fellowship in Bremerton, Washington. He is joining us today as we kick around the question, is there an inspired, inerrant apologetic method? My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie Baby.
Greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm tree came out, saw its shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time is gone. World's End Theology Outlet. Our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be Dr. Phil Fernandez, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter known as the Webcast, although we probably will not mention it again. The satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. Our regular notices: the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If you enjoy it or if it annoys you and you want to inflict it on someone else to ensure your continued access, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And as you do, never fear. This webcast is Y2K compliant, and don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. And here's where I find out if I remember to push the sound button here. Our guest for today's webcast is Dr. Phil Fernandez. Is it coming through on your end there? You can hear the applause, right? All right, so you know it's totally fake, but it's better than the fake we used to have, which was fake. So, fake. Yes.
I appreciate fake applause.
Yes, it's the sincerest thing we could muster at this point. So, anyways, welcome, Dr. Fernandez.
Oh, it's great to be here with you guys. So,
it's
you guys
good to have you.
So,
yeah. So you're like the president of, you are the president of the International Association of Christian Apologetics, of which I happen to be a charter member. So why is that?
One more week, because I give my final presidential address on Friday, and then I turn it over to Jason Crowder. So.
Oh, yeah. Jason Crowder. Okay, good. Yeah. So, good. Well, we're glad to be part. I'm glad to be part of that organization. So, and then what is the Institute of Biblical Defense? What do you do there, and why do you do it?
That's just basically my apologetics ministry. I found out real early on when I planted my church in 1988, Trinity Bible Fellowship, that I kept preaching sermons over my people's heads, and the Lord showed me that I need to meet my people where they're at. But then I also knew that all the study in apologetics I was doing, God, when God blesses us, he blesses us to be a blessing to others. So the more we learn about God's truth, the more we need to share that and with others. And so I had to find another venue in which to do that. And so I started the Institute of Biblical Defense. And so just my apologetics ministry, you can listen to my lectures or sermons or debates online. And so I started that in 1990, and that's where the source of my book, the research for my book over 30 years of research in apologetics caused me to want to write the Fernandez Guide to Apologetic Methodologies. So,
which is, for those who would like to know what that is, here we go. The Fernandez Guide to Apologetic Methodology. And this is important. You and I have talked about this at some of the conferences and things. Ron and I kind of kicked this around yesterday a little bit as well, because, and I find that this is more true of those who are sort of getting newly into apologetics, is they hear an apologetic method that they sort of fall in love with, and then tend to take that as the inspired inerrant apologetic method to the exclusion of anything else.
Yeah.
And I had a young individual that I had been kind of training along, and she started going to a Trinity seminary, and her and her friend were presuppositionalists, which is fine. And you know, she was kind of leaning on me that you have to use this. This is the only way to do apologetics. And I want you to debate my friend because he's better on it than I am. And I said, I don't really want to debate. I'm not so much into a particular methodology. I want to know where they're at and kind of figure out what I want to talk to them about next. So she pressed and pressed, and then they said, okay, we'll buy you lunch if you'll meet with us. I said, okay, fine. You buy free lunch. That's good. And I sat down and we talked for a few minutes. And then I said, so can you explain to me why I should embrace your presuppositions to be a presuppositionalist?
Yeah.
And they both kind of stared at me because now they have to go to something else to prove their
You've got it. I added an appendix in my Fernandez guide because I cover Van Tillian presuppositionalism and Gordon Clark's. He had one view and it switched to another view, but they were all, so there's 3 different types of presuppositional approaches. But I added an appendix on John Frame. God bless John Frame. He's such a great guy. And he has his own, he calls himself a presuppositionalist of the heart. And he likes Van Tillian presuppositionalism, but he acknowledges it's not the only way to defend the faith. And he says things like, if you just question one of the premises of Van Til's transcendental argument, which is the only argument Cornelius Van Til believed you could use, you just question one premise, and it forces the Van Tillian to defend that premise and to do just what you caused that lady to do, step outside of presuppositionalism, and now you've got more arguments that are being used when Van Til says there can only be one. But John Frame is a great man, great thinker. He's he's more, I would call him a neo-presuppositionalist or a verificationalist, because he allows his presupposition to be questioned and to be verified and to be confirmed. And so he's kind of a halfway house between traditional and classical apologist and the presuppositional camp.
Well, I am a presuppositionalist. I don't spend a lot of time, debating it with anybody. I really don't find much use in that. But I met John Frame once. We didn't get a chance to talk about that. But I do know that his tinkering with Van Til has been very controversial in Van Tillian circles. But
very, very pleasant in non-Van Tillian circles.
Yeah. Well, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it's been received. It's been received in different ways by different camps. If you're not a presuppositionalist at all, you're probably not going to like it anyways. But in terms of the, I have a little story which I think a lot of people have heard by now. It's Rosaria Butterfield's story, and basically she was converted through an application of presuppositionalism. At least that's what got the ball rolling for her. We don't really know the full. I don't know. She knows the full story of her conversion process, which was like a couple of years long. But she was a professor of English and queer studies at Syracuse University in New York. She was working on her next research project, which she decided would be evangelicalism, and in relationship to the LGBTQ, whatever movement it was back then. This is the 90s, or the late 90s, yeah. And she found out that a Promise Keepers conference was coming to Syracuse, and she thought, well, here's how I can begin my research. Up until then, her primary encounter with evangelicals was at gay pride parades where they held up picket signs, and she interpreted it all as hating, So she goes to this Promise Keepers conference. She writes a review about it. She's not particularly happy about it. I don't know if she was able to find too many problems with it, but we all remember that time. I mean, if you were not a believer, chances are you were biased against Promise Keepers. It just seemed, like a men's movement that could go wrong, and everybody was afraid of it. So she writes her column, and then she, as part of her research, she waits for the mail to come in, and as the letters come in, she divides them into two piles: hate mail and love mail. And then she gets this piece of correspondence from the pastor of a Presbyterian church in town, and he asks basically one question, and that is, have you examined your presuppositions? Have you, your underlying assumptions? And she didn't know what to do with the letter. She didn't know whether to put it in the hate pile or the love pile. She just couldn't figure it out. And she just sat there looking at it, and then she tried to get rid of it. She actually threw it in the recycle bin more than once. I forget how many times. And each time it just gnawed at her until she ran to the main place where she fished it out and brought it back. And finally, she calls the pastor. So I look at that as one particular application where if you think you're going to hit a brick wall with evidence, or if you have hit a brick wall with evidence, I would suggest maybe it's time to shift gears and go to the question like that.
Yeah. And the thing is, though, too, is the presentation of evidence doesn't automatically force the listener to accept the evidence. And I think all classical apologists acknowledge that. And you mentioned this lady, well, Norm Geisler, Josh McDowell. There are numerous cases of classical apologists who came to Christ through classical apologetic arguments. Myself, I didn't even care about truth. I kind of, I got knocked out of my last fight back in Jersey, and I wanted out of Jersey, and I couldn't afford to get out of Jersey. And a light heavyweight from the gym, from the police athletically, talked me into going in the Marine Corps with them on the buddy system. And I didn't want to be a Marine. He was all gung-ho about being a Marine, but I wanted out of Jersey, so I agreed to do it. Well, he didn't show up to take the oath. So here I was in the Marine Corps alone. It was somebody else's idea, not mine. I thought, okay, I just threw away 3 years of my life. And we had hostages in Iran, but Ronald Reagan got elected while I was in boot camp. And this was late 1980. And then by the time I got out of boot camp, Ayatollah Khomeini was coughing up the hostages. So instead of being a wartime Marine, I became a peacetime Marine. And they took the Marines with higher IQs and put us at duty stations like me. They sent me up to the Pacific Northwest to guard nuclear weapons, which is the most boring duty on earth. So I was going to have a nervous breakdown because New Jersey is a very fast-paced lifestyle. And everything was so slow. I thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown. The duties were so boring. And, nobody's going to, let's face it, nobody's going to mess with a whole bunch of United States Marines, well-armed Marines during nuclear missile movements. And we knew nobody was going to mess with us. So it was incredibly boring. And so I started to search for meaning. I started reading Hal Lindsey books. I don't know why. But
I don't either.
And it got to the point where, I started going back to Catholic Mass because my father seemed to find meaning there. And then a middle-aged lady invited us Marines to her house for a home-cooked meal. And we went there, and there's paintings of Jesus on the wall. So we thought, oh, no, man, we've been had. We were a rough bunch of guys from New York, New Jersey, and Boston, mostly Italian guys. So she knew she couldn't get through to us. So she told us that she got a friend who's an ex-convict who's going to come over and talk to us. So when the guy came over, I couldn't even, I wasn't even sure if I could whoop him. So I thought, he kind of gained my respect a little bit. And he explained the gospel message and invited me to it. This is an old Catholic charismatic prayer meeting. And that was a Sunday, that Tuesday night, I went and came to Christ. And So for me, it was a search for meaning. Life just seemed to be without meaning and stuff. But once I came to Christ, I started getting all kinds of questions from other Marines, objections to the Christian faith. So I started listening to the Bible Answer Man, Walter Martin, and started studying apologetics. Then eventually I enrolled in Liberty University and studied under Gary Habermas, and eventually I studied under Norm Geisler at Southern Evangelical Seminary. But while I was in the Marine Corps, I started, researching and finding. It was just a little tough back then without the internet, but finding answers to objections, and God used that. There are a lot of guys that, if you answered their objections, you remove the intellectual stumbling blocks, then it's like, okay, you chipped away at a hardened heart, and they're ready to exchange their worldview, their presuppositions centered around themselves, for the Christian worldview centered around the Lord Jesus Christ. And so, that's a little bit of my story, how I got into apologetics. And I've really related well with Walter Martin. He's from the New York, New Jersey area, and was very articulate, and only met him once. And it's just unfortunate he died so early. So
yeah, it was. I'm looking at your table of contents, and it's really amazing. I mean, this is a book that I've already kind of showed my hand. I'm a precept guy, but I want to read this stuff. You cover all these main players: Norm Geisler, William Lane Craig, J.P. Moreland, and I think this is really important, no matter which school you're coming from. To this, it's like a guide to the landscape.
Yeah.
It kind of says here's, I don't know how much of this you would call like a bird's eye 20,000 feet overview.
Oh yeah, no, I would definitely say that. Yeah.
But you need that kind of thing. You really, if you want to, and if you're serious about making apologetics a major part of your ministry, maybe your whole ministry, you need this. This is a guidebook.
Yeah, it's endorsed too by a who's who in Christian apologetics, with J.P. Moreland, and endorsed it Gary Habermas, Frank Turek.
Yeah.
Joe Holden out of Veritas International University. So my scholarship is credible, and I think, in fact, J.P. Moreland stated he thinks that every college or master's level apologetics course use this as one of the textbooks. And so I thought that was a really big compliment coming from JP. But whatever the case, and it's, it really covers well what was going on up to about 2000. And so now there's probably already a need for
well, what kind of changes do you think have happened since 2000?
Nothing major as far as the general defense of mere or essential Christianity. It's just that we have new players.
Okay.
So there's some people that would probably be offended because there's not a chapter on them. Well, you might be as big as Walter Martin was in the 1980s now, but I had to stop my research somewhere and then go through the long process of trying to get it published. And so so we've got other players now. As far as I think I will write someday a mostly cut and paste from my other works, but update it to kind of a conservative evangelical apologetics textbook, where I argue that a lot of the apologetics that's going on now is more of a C.S. Lewis mere Christianity, and inerrancy is kind of falling by the wayside. It's just like very few apologetics textbooks now will take the time to defend biblical inerrancy, and if they do, it's not a robust view of inerrancy. And so right now we're seeing in evangelical circles kind of a watering down of inerrancy, so that the apostles, the gospel authors, could be confused on details. As long as they get the main gist of the story correct, that's not an error. No, that's an error. God's God's in the details.
I mean, it basically, these are people who may have kind of skimmed through the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, but they haven't really read it in depth. And once you read it in depth, you really want to get Norm Geisler's commentary on it.
Oh, big time, big
You,
time.
you really, yeah, you really want to get there was, I mean, I actually, funny thing is, I just had an early 80s printing from the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy, ICBI, and it had a copy of the statement on inerrancy, the statement on hermeneutics, and it had a catalog of books
Yeah.
that were designed to support with argumentation all of the points made in both statements.
Yeah.
So there was a whole body of literature that came out, which if you're going to start tinkering with it, you better go back and read that bibliography.
This is the new battle for the Bible. The first one was the 1880s with B.B. Warfield and A.A. Hodge, and they won that. Machen won the battle in the 1930s, but realized it was time to get out of Princeton and found Westminster in Philadelphia.
And the OPC.
1970s was Harold Lindsell and Norm Geisler and John Warwick Montgomery and R.C. Sproul, and they won the battle. Unfortunately, Norm Geisler agree with me. We lost the battle in academic circles today. And so now if the present battle for the Bible is going to be won, it's going to be won by intelligent lay evangelicals and intelligent pastors and in the local churches, because the seminaries, we're going to send guys away to seminary, and they're going to come back and they're going to be explaining away miracles as metaphors. They're going to say the apostles were confused on these details. They're going to say the first 11 chapters of Genesis are either mythology or, as William Lane Craig says, mytho-historical.
Well, some of that, I would say, what I'm seeing now, I mean, how would you say Dallas is going with, is Lacuna still there at Dallas?
I don't know the persons there, but I have meetings of the Evangelical Theological Society going back to the early 2000s. Had a lot of alumni that would get up and present papers on what was being said in the classes. And this reminds me of Richard Land talking about the Baptist seminaries, the Southern Baptist seminaries in the early 1980s. You could get expelled if you brought a tape recorder to class, because the professors were saying stuff that was showing they really weren't true inerrantists. They weren't true evangelicals. One of the last prolonged conversations I had with Dr. Geisler was, I think it had about 2016, 2017 in Dallas, a meeting of the International Society of Christian Apologetics. And he said what's happened is, in academic circles, American evangelicalism has become European evangelicalism, because we sent so many guys to Europe to get their PhD degrees. Well, a European evangelical doesn't have to believe in inerrancy, doesn't have to believe in a historical Adam and Eve, can be a theistic evolution, and doesn't have to believe in eternal conscious torment. And all four of those are rampant, are very common among the members in good standing in the Evangelical Theological Society. And that's why Norm Geisler in 2006 founded the International Society of Christian Apologetics. So,
right, several of us resigned like within the same week.
Yeah,
when
and I almost joined, but
when the Evangelical Theological Society couldn't decide if God knew the future or not. He's learning and evolving, and so in my letter of resignation, I suggested they should keep the letters ETS, but change the name to Elastic Theological Society. So it sort of could include everybody.
Yeah, it's amazing how they haven't redefined inerrancy. They just redefined what an error is. So they can say, the apostle could be confused, but that's really not an error. You know, like with Michael Coney, who says Greco-Roman biography. Well, guess what? The Greco-Roman biographers were not inspired by God. So those dudes did make mistakes, and maybe they didn't care about making mistakes. But our God is a God of truth. Our God is a God who does not lie. You know, we're talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If he's going to reveal his truth to us, he's going to reveal his truth to us without errors in the original manuscripts.
So, you know, what we've done very quickly here, I mean, when you look at the table of contents in your book, and then you also look at what we just talked about, we've bounced around between a kind of an outward-facing apologetics,
Yeah.
which is we're dealing with atheists, and also we're dealing with cultists. So right there, you've got two really different. I mean, Walter Martin, you brought him up, and he's in your table of contents.
Yeah, I classify him as a comparative religious apologist.
There you go.
EMNR is just like leading the way on that.
Yeah,
you guys leading the scholarship on that big time.
So when you talk about, Don, a philosophy of apologetics, right there, you're going to use a really different philosophical approach, whatever you use between talking to. You're not going to need. I guess you could say dealing with the JW or Mormon is kind of like evidentialism, but the evidence is in the text.
Yeah, and that's why I classified it as comparative religious apologetics.
Yeah.
Late Walter Martin, he would, he'd give a few lectures on classical arguments for God's existence and historical evidence for the resurrection, but he primarily dealt with the cults.
Yeah.
Without his textbook, The Kingdom of the Cults, it's possible that many pastors would today think that Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses are just two very strange.
Unfortunately, many of them do anyway.
Right. It didn't help. Yeah. And then we also talked about inward-looking apologetics with inerrancy.
Yeah.
And we could throw a whole bunch of stuff in there, Enneagram, and I mean, all of these different weird ideas. Even physical.
Right. Even the physical resurrection. That's when I met Norm personally. I've been reading his books. And in '92, I was asked to go and give him a hand at Cornerstone Festival, which is, for those who are unaware, it was kind of like Christian Woodstock and a flea market. So you have 25,000 people there. And a lot of pastors are coming through the exhibition hall. And so I was asked to go down and help him there because the resurrection is one of my favorite doctrines. And as I spoke with pastors, 50%, easily 50%, started off with this question: how do we know the resurrection is physical? Now, I had no finesse, and so my response was, have you read the Bible? This seemed like a no-brainer to me.
You needed some tact. You need to learn tact. Is that what you're saying?
I did. I had to learn tact. As Joyce says, I'm kind of like Scrooge. Tact is something I despise.
I actually was driving in the passenger seat of a car at an evangelical conference with the president of a seminary. This was back in the 1990s, I believe. And there was an Assemblies of God pastor in the back seat listening to our conversation. And I was talking with the president of the seminary about, how Mary Harris had watered down the bodily resurrection of Christ, the physicality of it. And so we just kept going back and forth. And then I found out the pastor in the back seat was weeping. And so we asked him what was going on. And he said that he had been pastor for about 10 years. And I guess he wasn't preaching real solid doctrine. It just kind of the, more practical type stuff. But he said, I never realized that he bodily rose from the dead. And this was a pastor. And it was like, I felt sorry for him. I didn't view him as like a wolf in sheep's clothing. He just did not get the doctrinal mentoring and discipleship that he needed and the training that he needed. And he felt horrible about it. I do know the guy, and the guy is about as solid as you can be. And he has spent the last 30 years really studying biblical doctrine in depth. But that's the kind of problem that we want a guy with charisma behind the pulpit. We could care less if he knows what he's talking about.
Right. So Ron, the category that Ron was kind of picking up here is one that's really close to my heart, because as you guys know, I'm a missionary to cults and non-Christian religions. So a lot of what I do is, hanging out with Wiccans and Druids and witches and Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons and whatever. But along with that goes this internal problem that we have in the church, where we have the very same false teachings in the church. The Enneagram, as Ron pointed out, that's one. You have Christian tarot cards coming out of Bethel Church, destiny cards. You have a lot of occultism in the church.
Yeah.
The doctrine of the Trinity. In 2000, when Ron and I got a call about Gwen Shamblin and 30,000 churches across 60 denominations who denies the Trinity and thinks God is like this really big hunk, sort of like a heavenly Mel Gibson, who's not really bright and makes bad decisions. And as a result, he has to go and physically fight with the Satan to gain back our love.
Yeah.
How did she get into 30,000 churches? No one paid attention.
Yeah. Don, you're cutting edge on comparative religious apologetics, but also what I would call paranormal apologetics. And so sometimes we're answering questions that some people aren't asking. So we're giving evidence for God's existence when a guy says, I'm not looking for that. I know God exists. We're providing evidence for Jesus' resurrection. The guy might say, no, I don't have a problem with that. But when the person said, well, what do you think about Bigfoot? What do you think about aliens?
Exactly. Right.
And the thing is, we could say, well, that's beneath me. I'm not going to deal with that stuff because I'm a scholar and scholars don't talk about that stuff. And then we could lose these guys to the New Agers. Or we could say, you know what, from my study of the scriptures, I think I've got a good explanation as to what's actually going on. A really neat work was when you, Ross, Ken Samples, and I can't remember the other author, but they wrote a book dealing with the whole UFO movement and showing how it's demonic and it's not possible for entities from other planets to even make it to planet Earth. It's scientifically not possible. And if there were any, which I used to argue on college campuses, my thesis was evolution needs God, but God doesn't need evolution.
Right.
For evolution to be true, you got to have a miracle working God to bring something from nothing, life from non-life, multi-celled animals, single-celled animals, and all. Now I've had to change my argumentation, my thesis to aliens need God, but God doesn't need it. Because now
hold that thought, because our sponsor has some thoughts on this kind of an issue.
Right. Our friends at World's End Theology Outlet they have some questions. Are you still trying to figure out how to clean up in the ministry business? Do you want to finally learn how to get to the bottom of growing a successful church? Would you like to flush away your failures and start having your best church now? Well, then you need Charlatan Ultra Soft, because nothing says theologically soft like Joel Osteen's Charlatan Ultra Soft, and there's never any shortage of it. It's been personally tested by the man himself. It provides comfort where it counts, and it wipes away even the most stubborn orthodoxy. And it comes with a money-back guarantee. So keep those butts in the pews with Charlatan Ultra Soft, available only at World's End Theology Outlet. So, we got to pay the bills.
Yeah. So we're going to kind of go through each of them if we can, or lump them together. But I wanted to start off with this, and it's what I often refer to as the silver bullet syndrome. I get calls, Ron gets calls, emails, whatever, that kind of start out like this: I have a Jehovah's Witness coming in 3 hours. I have a Mormon I'm meeting with in a week. I have my Aunt Harriet just became a whatever. What verse do I give them to get them out? So they're looking for the silver bullet that you just shoot at them. They repent and believe, and I say it doesn't exist. There are other things that factor into this, starting with God and ending with God, and we're just tools He uses along the way.
Yeah.
There's also how you understand information and communicate it. There's how they understand information and receive it and interpret it. So there's a lot that's going on. So my suggestion is ask them, find out what they're invested in, ask them why they are what they are, and then start there. Because like you said, they're not really doubting sometimes that God exists. They want to know, what about Bigfoot? It's really a different question.
Yeah, and it's reminds me of Greg Kokel's tactics.
Exactly.
Where he witnesses and defends the faith by asking people questions about their views, and I find that very effective because most Americans don't want to be preached at. but they have an opinion on everything, even things they've never looked into. So if you keep asking people, and it's hard to build relationships with people, but if you ask people questions about what their views are, as you're showing them how shallow their views are, but you're saying, well, how do you know that's true? Why do you believe that? And but you're building relationships with people, and that's an important thing. You would probably like David Clark. I got a chapter of his on dialogical apologetics, where it's real person-centered, and he's got an eclectic approach, uses different apologetic approaches, but it's really person-centered. He deals with each person as an individual and tries to build relationships with them. And I think without doing that, we're just we're just talking to walls. And this is a computer age. It's an information age. We get overloaded with information, and it's not an intellectual age. And people are not very personal. They think that their Instagram friends are real friends, and so we got to figure out how can we, defend the faith with gentleness and respect, and use the wisdom God has given us. But to be able to do it, to build relationships with people and to spend time with them. I try to tell everybody, God bless you and be safe. Everybody was so nervous about COVID, so I added be safe to God bless you. Now, for me, it's not be safe from the virus. It's I think it was overrated. For me, it's be safe from the government and how the government. But it lets people know that, hey, I care about them, and if I go to a McDonald's drive-through enough, I could actually get some fellowship with the Christians and witness to them. When I go boxing, I'll go boxing tonight. I'm going to say God bless you to everybody I see. And most of them, these are guys that are cursing left and right, haven't been to church in 10, 15 years, but they respect me as a kind of an elder statesman of the boxers. And they'll do a fist pump to me. They'll say, God bless you. How you doing? If they have problems, they come to me for prayer. I invite them to church. I've got about 4 or 5 of them that are now coming to my church. So my evangelistic outreach, the great portion of that is when I go boxing with people. But it's one of those deals where you're exactly right. Why don't we start answering the questions that people actually have? Right. And there are people that say, I haven't seen any evidence for God's existence. Well, if we got some evidence, let's share with them. Paul said when he talked in Iconium, he told the people, God's not left us without a witness. He's given us the seasons. He's given us food. And he's telling us God is testifying to his existence through that. King David said, the heavens declare the glory of God and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. So we can point to evidences for God if that's what they're looking for. But the particular individual, it's like one philosopher said, we used to argue that God exists and Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. Now we have to argue only the true God exists. There's only one God that exists, and only Jesus bodily rose from the dead to immortality. And in other words, we're reaching a neo-pagan time where there's going to be people who are okay with Jesus rising from the dead, but they're going to believe everybody and their mother's brother rises from the dead. They're going to believe in all kinds of superstitious pagan type things. So we've really got to, when we do apologetics, we really got to take to heart, who is it that I'm talking to? Who is it that I'm dialoguing with? And what questions do they actually have?
Yeah, I had some years ago, I had a call, Joy and I had a call on our helpline from an atheist. He was married to a woman who had been a Jehovah's Witness for 7 years. He wanted her out. And my first question to him is, why? What are you going to take her to? She obviously has some religious interest, and you're an atheist. He said, I don't care. She just has to be out of this. And so he brought her over. Now, the problem was he lied to her about who we were. So then, as we're sitting there, I'm trying to think where we're going to go, because she's not happy about being there. She's sitting on the couch, arms crossed, next to Joy. And so I started talking to him about the existence of God. And Joy picked up on it, and she started talking to him about the existence of God. And lo and behold, in a few minutes, she, the wife, is engaged in talking about the existence of God. Why? She wants him to believe in God. Why? Because she wants him to become a Jehovah's Witness. Yeah. And he is getting irritated that we're not talking to her about Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, what he didn't know is we were talking about every one of the Jehovah's Witness doctrines because we were comparing other non-Jehovah's Witness groups that held the same views.
Yeah.
They left. She didn't talk the whole way home, he said. He didn't know what was going on. The next Saturday we met, and she had become a believer.
Wow.
The reason she did is because she kept saying to herself, I know this group is a cult. I know this group is a cult. I know this group is a cult. And I believe the same things these cults believe.
Wow.
Am I in a cult?
Wow.
And it brought her to the faith. So you can talk to somebody by talking about other groups, which is so. Let's take a quick. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting too that we got to draw the distinction between soft agnostics and hard agnostics. And agnostic says, well, a soft agnostic, I haven't seen enough evidence to believe that God exists, but maybe you have. Maybe you can convince me. And I'm not anti God. Who knows? Maybe God does exist. The hard agnostic is like the Richard Dawkins. I haven't seen enough evidence for God, therefore there is not enough evidence.
No evidence, right.
God. Now, when I debated Eddie Tabash at Washington State University, after the debate, the philosophy professor who was the moderator came up to me and said, wow, you did really well. And I said, yeah, so did Eddie, just to be nice. And he said, no, you did really well. Telling me you won the debate. And I said, well, are you a theist? The debate was, does God exist? He said, no, actually, I'm an agnostic. But I take my wife's a traditional Catholic, and I take her to Mass on Sundays. And out of respect for her faith, I attend Mass with her. Then he looked around, made sure no other professors or students were around, and he leaned forward and he whispered to me, and I'm starting to enjoy the Mass. So, so there's a guy you could talk with. There's a guy open to the possibility that, maybe my wife's right. Maybe God does exist. And I also found when I debated at Princeton, though the professors were very opposed to belief in God, the students were very open to it. And I think it's because New Jersey is so Roman Catholic. When the professors say that you can't be an intelligent person, and back then it was the 20th century, in the 20th century, and still believe that God exists, they would roll their eyes and say, no, I got lots of buddies.
Yeah.
Campus that are intelligent, and they believe God exists.
And when you say that, when you tell that story, and maybe today, you mentioned this was the 90s when this happened. I think things do change in the apologetics terrain in terms of how you have to apply things. But when you mentioned that, I think you said Norm Geisler and others were convinced by classical apologetics arguments. I would still, as a precept guy, I would still say the reason they worked was because those arguments challenged the very presupposition you just mentioned, which is there are no rational arguments for God's existence. So as soon as you if you get, I believe God has to be at work. I believe that the person.
I think you might enjoy the appendix of John Frame's critique of Van Tillian presuppositionalism, because it's John Frame is a very gracious guy. It's not for him. His presuppositionalism is I would call it verificationalism, but it's not my way or the highway. And he does note that though Thomas Aquinas, a lot of his philosophy was based on Aristotle's philosophy, a non-Christian philosophy, he does note Immanuel Kant's influence and German idealism, and that influence on the starting of presuppositional thought. So he's
I mean, I don't think anybody who studied Van Til denies that he's taking a page out of Kant, and using it contrary to the way Kant used it.
Yeah, but he's still, and it's kind of like, what Frame is pointing out, though, is that the idea that Van Tillian apologetics comes solely from the Bible, even John Frame, probably the second most famous.
Yeah, I think you're going to find somebody even more seminal for Van Til in Calvin, and I think you don't have to go any further than the Institutes. I don't have the book and chapter handy here, but you see the pattern laid out in Calvin's Institutes for what Van Til comes up with.
I read Fesco's work on that. All the
Well, yeah,
early,
Fesco doesn't like Van Til, so
yeah, but there is the book of Scripture and the book of nature.
no, yeah, I
Even
don't think.
shows even shows where Calvin wrote his Institutes along the lines of scholasticism wasn't a full blown you got to accept Aquinas, but it was a way of teaching and a way of writing, and so I think Bernard Ram accurately uh, talked about Calvin's apologetic approach. I have a few pages on Calvin's approach in the history of Christian apologetics. I do not consider him a presuppositionalist. So.
Well, I do consider Calvin a presuppositionalist.
Yeah,
And,
all
and
presuppositionalists would, but yeah.
Well, yeah, the reason I do is just because of the way he addresses it and the way he brings evidences in as being primarily for the believer, and basic for the purpose of saying, hey, you're not crazy. These atheists and agnostics are going to tell you you're nuts for believing these evidences. Well, when even an atheist and an agnostic very often, if they're being honest, when they look at the evidence, they'll have to say, well, yeah, I might not agree with your interpretation of the evidence, but I have to at least agree that it's a rational argument. Now, then you get other atheists and agnostics who don't even go that far.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a place for presuppositionalism, but I agree with John Frame. If you can argue from God to truth and morality and meaning and the sanctity of human life, you could also argue from those things to God. And
well, and I don't deny that. I just deny the how the efficacy or on their own. In other words, if that's what I rely upon, I'm going to be butting my head against the wall with a lot of atheists and agnostics. I think there comes a time when you just have to do what that pastor did with Rosaria Butterfield and say, well, what about, you're assuming a lot of things here. Well, let's look at those for a minute. Yeah.
Right. Which now takes me back to trying to find out what the reason is they're rejecting, because it may have nothing whatever to do with that. It may be they had a pastor that was mean to them. That's a whole different kind of question.
I mean, that's true.
So I talked to several of the Wiccans and a couple of the females. When I asked them, why are you what you are? Their response was, I was in a, they named the kind of church, and I was sexually molested, and the church didn't do anything for me. I needed a religion that gave me power over my life, and Christianity doesn't do that. So their rejection was based on a false understanding of Christianity, and also a false understanding of what Wicca provides. Now, we are 11 minutes away from ending, roughly. Can you kind of go through chapter by chapter? Here's the chapter title. Here's what it's basically about, so people can kind of get a feel for it.
I had it in front of me a second ago. Let me.
Yeah, I could actually.
I got ready.
Since there are like numerous, classical apologists, numerous presuppositionalists, I could just basically run down the list of. I came up with 17 different approaches, 17 different methodologies, but I suggest at the end that we should go back to the Gordon Lewis and Bernard Ram way, where you look at each individual apologist, and because each individual apologist has a different approach, and do it person-centered. But basically, there's classical apologetics, where you argue first for God's existence, and then you go to historical evidences for Jesus' resurrection and deity. There's historical apologetics, often called evidentialism, where you just go right to the historical evidences. Cumulative case apologetics, like Paul Feinberg, where you use lots of different things to test worldviews. So it's a cumulative case for God. We already talked about the dialogical approach of David Clark, where it's person-centered, and he'll use classical arguments in a more humble fashion, but he's dealing with each person as an individual, building relationships with them. There's the transcendental presuppositionalism of Cornelius Van Til, where you presuppose the existence of the triune God who revealed himself in scriptures, and you can tear down, show the contradictions in other worldviews, but you can only use the transcendental argument, his argument for God. Then there was the dogmatic presuppositionalism of Gordon Clark, where he's a rationalist, but you can't rationally prove your presupposition, your first premise, because if you could prove it, you'd end up with an infinite regress. And so you have to just dogmatically presuppose your first premise. So he arbitrarily presupposes the existence of the triune God who reveals himself in scriptures and the law of non-contradiction, and then he tries to deduce all truth from that. Later on, his view evolved into, as Ronald Nash pointed out, into scripturalism, where truth is only found in the scriptures. You couldn't even find any truth in the five senses and sense perception, anything else. So he would try to deduce the axioms of geometry from the scriptures, and that's the scripturalism view. Comparative religious apologetics like Walter Martin and you, Don, where you get out there and you take the Christian worldview and you defend that versus the non-Christian cults, non-Christian religions. Testimonial apologetics. A lot of people say they don't like apologetics, but they shared the evidence of their changed lives. And somebody's experience is not a rationally strong argument for Christianity, yet testimonial apologetics is probably the most effective way.
You know, and that's, I think the word people use is compelling. You know, and especially you'll hear the phrase, this really came to the fore in postmodernism, a compelling story. And I think they were tapping into something that predates postmodernism, which is what you're just talking about here.
Paul used his testimony when on trial. And so he was doing testimonial apologetics. There's narrative apologetics.
Yeah.
Like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And verificationalism is it's like presuppositionalism, but they allow their presupposition to be verified. There's the Reformed epistemology, which very few Reformed hold to, of Alvin Plantinga.
Right.
God is a properly basic belief. So you can provide evidence for God, but you don't need to. Some people just know that God exists. Then there's cultural apologetics, where you sound the warning that if like American culture gives up on Christianity, the consequences are going to be incredibly ugly, and that a culture built on Christian principles, the Christian worldview, is a society that will flourish, and there'll be freedom and prosperity. There's psychological apologetics of Blaise Pascal, where he deals with the will and the imagination, not so much the reason. Even though he was a mathematician, he knows that most of our views, we choose them by our will or our desires, and then we sneak reason in the back door to argue for what we believe based on unrational premises. And then scientific apologetics, I think it deserves its own title, whether they're young earth creationists or old earth creationists. They use scientific evidences for God. Paranormal apologetics, where you deal with, what do you think of Bigfoot? What do you think of aliens? Do you think there's life on other planets? What about the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, and things of that sort? And I think that we really need to take people more seriously when they have those questions. And I think the Bible provides the answers. We got to test the spirits, because they're not all from God. And then finally, combinationalism, where you find most apologists will not use one of these approaches, but will use 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. And I'm very eclectic. I'm like Saint Bonaventure. I never heard an argument for God I didn't like. And so we got different approaches, and I think that we could appreciate that. Now, my next book, I'll probably get into conservative evangelical apologetics, where you do some polemics, where we got guys that are doing a great job defending Jesus' resurrection or God's existence, but then they talk about errors in the Bible, but they don't call them errors, so they can still call themselves inerrantists. Say, well, back then, using Greco-Roman biography, being confused on the details wasn't really an error. Or saying that there's a miracle in the middle of a historical narrative, it could be a metaphor, and that's not that's not an error in any way. And so we're seeing an awful lot of that. We're seeing guys today. If you read Craig Blomberg's book, he's one of these guys that does this stuff, but he says you can still be an evangelical and accept like these 15 different problem areas. You go back to the 1970s, and Harold Lindsell says that those 15 areas or so, they were being held by guys who denied inerrancy.
Right.
So now we got guys who still claim to be an inerrantist who are agreeing with the errantist of the
So
1970s.
what we're seeing is something that we have seen all down through the history of the people of God.
Amen.
If you go back to the Old Testament, God said, don't do this.
Yeah.
And they will go, okay. And then they begin doing it, but they would redefine what they're doing.
Exactly.
All right. And you come into the church, and I've been speaking on this a lot lately. Every one of the New Testament books, with the exception of Philemon probably, is written really for 4 reasons: to refute heresy, expose heretics, address bad behavior, and lay down sound doctrine. Those 4 things. And I was talking with someone, they said, well, what about like the Gospel of John? I go, that's how it starts out. They said, what do you mean? I said, well, think about it. What's he do? In the beginning, he points you back to Genesis. What's he writing about? He's writing against Docetism. Was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So he's establishing that the Word, whoever that is God.
Yeah.
And the Word became flesh, he tells us. Who's that? That's Jesus. So Jesus is the Word. What he's doing is saying, number 1, he's God. Number 2, he created everything that's created. If he didn't create it, it isn't created. Number 3, he incarnated in physical form. He's refuting heresy. And then everything that follows in John is pointing back to those first 18 verses.
Yeah.
It's an apologetic for the faith.
Yeah, big time. he gives the reason why he wrote it. He said, I told you about his miracles so that by learning of the eyewitness testimony of these miracles that you would believe.
That you would believe.
The Son of God, and believing in him, you'd have eternal life. Yeah.
Right. So he starts with his apologetic, he ends with his apologetic, and everything in the between is pointing to the apologetic. Yeah. It's a great book, I think. So that's good.
Well,
so now one of the things that I often try to suggest to people is, because we have this idea that our task is to proclaim the gospel that they will believe, which is part of our task. But it seems to me, if we read the Great Commission, it adds more to the discussion than that. It says to make disciples. It doesn't say to make believers.
Yeah.
Now, I think this is how I view it, and you guys tell me if I'm totally out to lunch, that we disciple people into the faith, and then we disciple them after they're in the faith.
Yeah.
We use apologetics to disciple them into the faith, and we use apologetics then to continue teaching them about the faith.
Yeah, I don't know when the apostles got saved. I mean, there's a point where they said some things where I'm like, wow, does this guy even believe at this point? But Jesus was already discipling them, and some people in the process of discipleship come to Christ. But I would also say this too: Jesus, if I was God and I became a man, I'd be God on world tour. Jesus said, no, that's not the best approach. The best approach was quality discipleship was more important than quantity evangelism. He would speak to the thousands at time. He would do one-on-one evangelism at time, but he spent the bulk of his time discipling 12 guys who probably helped him disciple the 72 other disciples.
Right.
And I always feel sorry because Jesus was very organized. So probably each of the apostles probably discipled 6 of the other disciples. So I really feel sorry for the 6 guys who got stuck with Judas. But whatever the case, I tell my people, the most powerful thing that our church does is not when I'm preaching from the pulpit. It's when you have coffee with a friend on a Saturday morning at the pancake house, and you disciple them and all. And God does big, powerful, explosive things through little things. And and if those little things aren't done, we're not gonna be doing work for God's kingdom without those things. So we got we got to get away from the cult of celebrity.
Right.
Yeah.
Realize,
I just keep coming back to Acts 2:42. They continued in the apostles' doctrine,
amen.
the breaking of bread, the fellowship, and the prayers. And I think all four of those things, I think prayer and fellowship they all go together with each other. But there is a chemistry, if you will, between fellowship and prayer that is mutually binding. I think all four are mutually binding, but if we just came and listened to sermons and left, I mean, yeah, there's a sense in which we would be bound together by the hearing of God's word and what the Spirit does in our hearts. But God doesn't want to stop there. He wants us to make sure we also observe the Lord's Supper, reminding us of the gospel, pray with each other, fellowship with each other, because this will give us the full, it binds us to Jesus.
Yeah.
At the same time that it binds us to each other. So when you said that that's the most important, I would prefer to say co-equal, that they're all equally important. None of them can exist without the other.
Yeah. And the thing is, though, and what you're pointing to too is those little things that I talked about. A lot of those are supposed to go on at church. We're like Hebrews 10, 23 to 25. When we go to church, are we just a spectator, or are we stimulating one another to life of love and good deeds? And so, but it's one of those deals where so many mega churches. There's some mega churches that built their churches the right way, but that's the hard way. It's the biblical way. The easy way to build a mega church is tell people what they want to hear, entertain them. And so unfortunately, most mega churches got to be mega churches by emptying small churches of spiritual warriors and turning them into spectators and entertaining them. And that's really, really sad. But I'm telling you, the pastor's supposed to, the pastoral staff is supposed to equip the saints for service through the power of God and for God's glory. But the service has got to be done by the people in the pews. And some of that service goes on in the church service. But most of it's going to go on, Monday through Saturday when they get out there in the community, like we mentioned, asking questions, answering questions, building relationships with people, discipling people. And I think any guy who tries to mega disciple more than 12 is trying to outdo Jesus.
Right. That's exactly right.
So
and another kind of an aspect of this, and my pastor, I have a great relationship with my pastor. Anytime something kind of hinky comes up, he has whoever it is to call and say, call Don. That's kind of his area. So my task is to help guard the flock from false teaching creeping in. And I often have to communicate to pastors that I know that you're trying to do your job well. I do understand that. But you have no control really over what your people are picking up once they walk out of your building.
Yeah.
And they are trusting. I just had a call on this 2 days ago. They are trusting Christian publishers and buying books that are terribly heretical from Christian publishers. And so then they pick up these ideas that they've picked up from this heretical book that say, I don't know, Thomas Nelson published, because they publish a lot of them. And they assume it's okay. And the pastor assumes it's okay because it's Thomas Nelson, until I start going through and going, okay, here's what they're teaching here. God is not, Jesus isn't God. The Trinity isn't true, blah, 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 blah. And they go, I never saw that. I said, you didn't read the book. You trusted it. So we get our views by osmosis. It's the people we're with. It's the books we read. It's the television we watch. And that's why what you're saying about what happens in the church is very important. We need to practice all of these things within the body as often as possible.
Yeah, now you got a really good pastor because he's responsible to protect his flock from heresy, but he recognizes he can't do it all.
Right.
And so he knows when to delegate, and he knows he's got this guy Don out there that he can delegate some of that to him, and he can help through the power of the Holy Spirit deliver people from these heretical views. But I was reading a work from Gene Edward Veith Jr. And he mentioned a poll, Pew Research poll, 2020, that about 47% of evangelicals dabble in at least one New Age practice or entertain some New Age belief. So, I mean,
that is an old poll. It's higher now.
That's really, really sad, and it just amazes me that the thing is too is you ask the right questions, you baptize somebody, they seem like they're solid in the faith, they've accepted the gospel and all, and then 2 weeks later they're talking about all religions lead to God, and I'm like, what did we just talk about 2 weeks ago? But it's amazing how when people are not trained in critically thinking, which was the norm, you just normally train people to originally think and critically think, and now we just indoctrinate in our schools and wokeness. But if people are dehumanized and no longer critically think, they're perfectly content to live a life with contradictory beliefs. And so they can sound real Christian, but then you look at their other views and, it's kind of like, I've got some Catholic friends that seem to be real Christ-centered. And when they talk with me, it sounds like, well, this guy's really born again, really trusting Jesus for salvation. But then he goes home and says the rosary, 10 Hail Marys to every Our Father. It's like, where does God draw the line and say, hey, you're not really one of mine? And I think the best, let's try to be as true to the scriptures as possible, as faithful to God as possible, so we don't have to be shaken in our boots on the judgment day, because we know we're his. We know him, and we know we belong to him. But
okay. Now, there's a number of links in the description below to catch up with Phil. He also does have a webcast, and the very first one you see, he'll go, if you don't like what I'm doing, start your own.
Probably the best way to find out what I'm doing is to go to TrinityBibleFellowship.org, TrinityBibleFellowship.org, and they'll get access to over 1,900 sermons and lectures that I've done over the years. So.
All right. Ron, would you waltz us out of here?
Let's give credit to whom credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil Before Me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon archives manager is Polly Gummis. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yolande Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham & Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never happened.
It has been, all attempts have failed, and we don't know how many there because...
Phil, thank you. Everyone else, we will see you next week.